The cursed warriors of the Appalachians, spirits who return from the grave to avenge their blood. This is no campfire legend. This is the documented tragedy of the Harlow family. A bloodline so entangled within itself that by 1946, the mountains of eastern Kentucky held secrets darker than any European battlefield could ever reveal. Deep within the folds of Pike County, where fog clings to the hollows like forgotten memories, stood the Harlow homestead. A cluster of weathered cabins barely visible from the nearest dirt road housed what locals called the Closed Ones. Since the 1780s, the Harlows had lived in these mountains, when the first settlers carved their existence from wilderness. But while other families married into neighboring communities, the Harlows turned inward. Generation after generation, cousin married cousin, uncle took niece as wife, and the family tree became a twisted vine that choked itself. By the spring of 1946, when 3 young men returned from the war in Europe, the Harlow bloodline had been folding in on itself for over 160 years. The consequences were written in flesh and bone. Thomas Harlow, 24 years old, stepped off the train in Pikeville on March 12, 1946. His uniform hung loose on his frame, decorated with ribbons that spoke of Normandy and the Ardennes. But his eyes, set too far apart on a face that seemed to slope unnaturally, carried something beyond battle trauma. Thomas was the son of first cousins. His grandfather had married his own niece. The genetic lottery had been kinder to him than to others, but the signs were there for anyone who looked closely enough. With Thomas came his brothers, Daniel and Joseph. Daniel, 22, walked with a pronounced limp, his left leg noticeably shorter than his right, a deformity no war injury could explain. Joseph, barely 19, had the mind of a child despite his age. His speech was slurred and simple, his fingers webbed together on both hands. All 3 were returning to a home where such appearances were not abnormalities, but the expected outcome. The journey up the mountain took 6 hours by mule and foot. The path twisted through dense forest where spring had barely touched, the air still sharp with winter's remnants. Local guide Marcus Webb, hired to lead them home, watched the brothers with unconcealed unease. He had heard the stories about the Harlows, whispers shared in church pews and general stores, tales dismissed as mountain superstition until you saw the family with your own eyes. "How many folks still up there?" Marcus asked, his voice careful, neutral. Thomas answered without turning, his voice flat and distant. 17, last letter said. Mama, Papa, the aunts, the young ones. Maybe more by now. Maybe more. The words hung in the cold air like a threat. They arrived as dusk settled over the hollow. The homestead emerged from the shadows like something from another century. 5 cabins arranged in a rough circle, connected by worn paths and shared desperation. Smoke rose from crude chimneys, chickens scattered at their approach. And then the family appeared. Margaret Harlow, the matriarch, was 56 but looked 70. Her face bore the unmistakable signs. Eyes that sat at slightly different heights, a jaw that jutted forward unnaturally, ears that were smaller than normal and set too low. She rushed forward with a cry more animal than human, embracing her sons with a fierce possessiveness that made Marcus Webb take an involuntary step back. Behind her came the others. Sarah, Thomas's sister-wife, for she was both sibling and spouse in this tangled family, held a child of perhaps 3 years, a little girl whose head was disproportionately small, whose eyes wandered independently. Old Abraham Harlow, the patriarch at 68, shuffled forward on legs bowed so severely that each step seemed an act of defiance against anatomy itself. His brother-nephew Caleb stood in the doorway of the largest cabin, his expression vacant, drool running unnoticed down his chin. Marcus Webb counted them as they emerged. 17, just as Thomas had said, but the count included at least 5 children under 10, each bearing physical markers of severe inbreeding, microcephaly, facial asymmetry, skeletal deformities, intellectual disabilities ranging from mild to profound. This was not a family. This was a genetic catastrophe unfolding in slow motion across generations. The reunion was chaotic. Voices overlapping, hands reaching, pulling the soldiers into the fold. Marcus watched Thomas's face shift from the hardness of a war veteran to something else, something that looked almost like resignation. This was home. This was what he had survived Hitler's armies to return to. Mr. Webb. Margaret Harlow's voice cut through the noise, sharp despite her deteriorated appearance. You've done your duty. You can go now. It was not a request. Marcus nodded, anxious to leave, to put distance between himself and this place where nature's laws had been violated for so long that the violations had become tradition. But as he turned to go, young Joseph grabbed his arm with those webbed fingers, his childlike face earnest and frightened. Don't leave us here, Joseph whispered, his words barely intelligible. Please, they'll make us stay. They'll make us continue it. Hush now. Margaret's hand struck Joseph's shoulder with surprising force. Don't speak nonsense to outsiders. Get inside, all of you. Marcus pulled free, his heart hammering. He didn't run down the mountain path, but he wanted to. Behind him, he heard the cabin doors closing, heard the family drawing back into itself like a wounded animal retreating to its den. By the time he reached Pikeville the next morning, he would tell the story at the diner. Most would shake their heads sadly. Some would make jokes. None would do anything, because in 1946 in the isolated mountains of eastern Kentucky, what happened in the hollows stayed in the hollows. The Harlows were known, whispered about, pitted perhaps, but they were left alone. After all, they weren't hurting anyone except themselves, or so people told themselves. But the soldiers had returned from war with something new, the knowledge that the world beyond the mountains existed, and the growing realization that what their family had done, what they were expected to continue doing, was not natural, not right, not survivable much longer. That first night back, Thomas lay in the cabin he would share with Sarah, his sister-wife, and their malformed daughter. Through the thin walls, he could hear the sounds of the family settling in, the coughs and moans and whispered conversations. He thought of the men he'd served with, men from cities and farms and towns where families were connected by choice and love, not by the desperate arithmetic of isolation and tradition. He thought of what Joseph had whispered. They'll make us continue it, and Thomas knew with the certainty that only comes from seeing death up close that something had to change. The war had shown him horrors, yes, but it had also shown him that horrors could be fought, could be ended. The Harlow family's curse was not supernatural. It was not mystical. It was biological, sociological, generational. It was a trap built by ancestors and maintained by isolation. The question was whether he had the strength to break it, or whether the mountains and the blood and the weight of 160 years would pull him back down into the hollow, back into the cycle, back into the darkness that had consumed every Harlow before him. Outside, an owl called. The sound echoed through the hollow, lonely and hollow itself. A voice crying out in a wilderness that had forgotten how to answer. The weeks following the soldiers' return brought a deceptive calm to the Harlow homestead. Spring finally pushed into the hollow, bringing the smell of thawing earth and new growth. But inside the cabins, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. Thomas, Daniel, and Joseph had brought back more than medals and trauma. They had brought questions. On a gray morning in early April 1946, Thomas sat at the rough-hewn table in the main cabin, a piece of paper before him and a stubby pencil in his hand. Around him, the family moved through their morning routines. Margaret stirred a pot of thin porridge over the fire. Sarah nursed their daughter while trying to keep the child's wandering eyes focused. Abraham coughed wetly in the corner, his lungs destroyed by decades of smoke in these poorly ventilated cabins. Thomas was drawing a family tree. It was something he'd learned during the war, mapping command structures. But this tree was different. This tree twisted back on itself, branches connecting in ways that made his stomach turn. His great-grandfather, Ezekiel Harlow, had married his first cousin, Ruth. Their children had married each other and their cousins. His grandfather, Silas, had taken his own niece, Emma, as a wife. His parents, Abraham and Margaret, were first cousins once removed. Sarah, his sister-wife, was also his second cousin. The mathematical reality was devastating. By his rough calculation, he and Sarah shared approximately 37% of their genetic material. Their daughter, little Mary, was essentially the genetic equivalent of a child born to parent and child, brother and sister. The coefficient of inbreeding was so high that Thomas, with his limited education, could barely comprehend the numbers. "What are you doing?" Margaret's voice cut through his concentration. She stood over him, her misaligned eyes trying to focus on his paper. Trying to understand, Thomas replied quietly. Trying to figure out how it got this bad. This bad. Margaret's voice rose, defensive and angry. This is our family. This is how it's always been. Your great-great-grandfather settled this land, and we've kept it in the family, kept it pure, kept it ours. Pure. Daniel spoke up from where he sat near the fire, his withered legs stretched out before him. Look at us, Mama. Look at Joseph. Look at Mary. Look at Uncle Caleb, who can't even feed himself. This isn't pure. This is poison. The word hung in the air. Poison. It was the first time any of them had spoken so directly about what everyone knew but never acknowledged. Abraham shuffled forward, his bowed legs making each step a struggle. At 68, he was the oldest living Harlow, a miracle of survival considering the family's history. Most didn't make it past 50. His face, a roadmap of genetic catastrophe, contorted with anger. You boys went to war and came back thinking you're better than us, he spat. Thinking you know more than your ancestors. We survived here for over 160 years. We didn't need outsiders. We didn't need their judgment. We survived. Thomas stood, his voice rising despite his attempt to stay calm. Papa, I've been home 3 weeks and I've counted 17 of us. Do you know how many Harlows there were in 1880? I found the old Bible records. 43. In 1900, 36. In 1920, 29. We're not surviving. We're dying out. One generation more damaged than the last. He grabbed the family tree he'd drawn and held it up. Look at this. Every marriage for the past 5 generations has been between close relatives. First cousins, second cousins, uncle and niece, even closer than that. We all know it. We just don't say it. Sarah began to cry softly, clutching Mary closer. The child made a strange mewing sound, her small head lolling to one side. She would never speak, never walk, never live a normal life. She was 29 months old and had the development of a 6-month-old infant. And everyone in this cabin knew exactly why. So what do you propose? Margaret's voice was cold now, calculating. You want to leave. You want to bring outsiders in. You want to destroy everything your ancestors built. I want, Thomas said carefully, to stop destroying our children. The silence that followed was profound. Even the fire seemed to quiet, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. Joseph, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, suddenly spoke up, his childlike voice breaking the tension. I don't want to marry Cousin Rebecca. I don't want to make babies that hurt. I seen enough hurt in the war. I don't want to make more hurt. Rebecca was 13, Joseph's second cousin, and it was understood within the family that when she turned 15, she would become Joseph's wife. It was how things were done. It was tradition. But Joseph, despite his intellectual limitations, had grasped something fundamental that the others refused to acknowledge. The tradition was killing them. You'll do as you're told, Abraham said. But his voice lacked conviction. For the first time, Thomas saw doubt in his father's eyes. The old man knew. They all knew. The evidence was undeniable, written in the twisted bones and malformed faces of their children, in the high infant mortality rate that everyone attributed to God's will, in the adults who barely made it past middle age. Thomas made a decision in that moment. I'm going to talk to the doctor in Pikeville. Dr. Harrison. I'm going to ask him about what happens when families do what we've done. You'll bring shame on us, Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. You'll have people talking, social workers coming. They'll take the children. Maybe they should, Daniel said quietly. Maybe the children deserve better than this. The words were treason. They were betrayal. They were also the truth, and once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. That night, after a dinner eaten in hostile silence, Thomas lay awake listening to the sounds of the hollow. He thought about the soldiers he'd served with, Men who talked about their families back home with pride, not shame. He thought about the future he'd imagined during the war. Then he looked at Sarah sleeping beside him, her face slack in sleep, revealing the asymmetry they all tried to ignore, and he felt a crushing guilt. She was his sister. She was his wife. She was his second cousin. She was the mother of his severely disabled child. These facts could all be true simultaneously because for 160 years, the Harlows had made them true. They had created their own reality in this isolated hollow, a reality that violated every natural law of genetics and health and called it tradition. But tradition, Thomas was learning, was just another word for repeating the mistakes of your ancestors until those mistakes became inescapable. He thought of the arithmetic. 37% shared genetic material. Rates of genetic disorders increasing exponentially. A family tree that looked more like a wreath, every branch connecting back to itself in an endless, suffocating loop. The Harlows weren't cursed by spirits or haunted by ghosts. They were prisoners of biology, trapped in a genetic death spiral of their own making. And the only way out was to do the one thing the family had never done, let the outside world in. As dawn broke over the Appalachian Hollow, Thomas Harlow made a vow. He would go to Pikeville. He would talk to the doctor. He would break the silence that had protected this family's secrets for over a century and a half. Even if it meant destroying the only world he'd ever known. Even if it meant betraying the people he loved. Because love, he was beginning to understand, sometimes meant having the courage to end traditions that were killing the ones you claimed to protect. The road down from the hollow felt longer than Thomas remembered. Every step took him farther from the only life he'd known toward a confrontation with truths he'd spent 24 years avoiding. It was April 23, 1946, and the spring morning was bright and warm, a cruel contrast to the darkness of his mission. Dr. Raymond Harrison had been practicing medicine in Pikeville for 32 years. His office sat above the pharmacy on Main Street. He'd seen everything mountain life could throw at a physician. But when Thomas Harlow walked through his door that morning, Dr. Harrison knew immediately this would be a different kind of case. Dr. Harrison, Thomas began, removing his worn cap and turning it nervously in his hands. I need to ask you about family relations. About what happens when families marry too close. The doctor, a man of 60 with kind eyes, gestured for Thomas to sit. Go on. What followed was a confession that took nearly an hour. Thomas laid out the history of the Harlow family with brutal honesty. The generations of cousin marriages, the uncle-niece unions, the systematic isolation. He described the physical deformities, the intellectual disabilities, the shortened lifespans. Dr. Harrison listened without interruption, his expression growing graver with each revelation. When Thomas finished, the doctor was silent for a long moment. What you're describing, Dr. Harrison finally said, is one of the most severe cases of inbreeding depression I've ever encountered. Do you understand what that means? Thomas shook his head. The doctor pulled out a piece of paper and began to draw. Every person carries genetic information from their parents. Some of that information includes what we call recessive traits, things that don't show up unless you inherit the same trait from both parents. Most of the time, this doesn't matter because unrelated people rarely carry the same harmful recessive traits. But when relatives have children together, especially close relatives, the chances increase dramatically. He drew a simple diagram. First cousins who marry have about a 6 to 8% increased risk of birth defects. That might not sound like much, but it compounds with each generation. When you have multiple generations of consanguineous marriage, especially with relationships closer than first cousins, the risks become catastrophic. Thomas felt his chest tighten. How catastrophic? Your family has been intermarrying for how long? Over 160 years. Dr. Harrison's voice was gentle but firm. Thomas, I need you to understand something. What's happening to the Harlows isn't supernatural. It's not a curse. It's basic biology. You've created a situation where genetic diversity has essentially collapsed. The children being born now are carrying multiple copies of harmful genetic variants. The physical deformities you describe, the intellectual disabilities, these are all predictable outcomes. The doctor paused. And it will only get worse. Each generation that continues this pattern will face increasingly severe problems. You're approaching what geneticists call an extinction vortex, a point where a population becomes so genetically compromised that it cannot sustain itself. Thomas felt something inside him break. Hearing it explained in scientific terms made it somehow worse. Can it be fixed? Not easily, not quickly, and not without drastic changes. Dr. Harrison leaned forward. The family needs to stop all consanguineous relationships immediately. Every member of reproductive age needs to marry outside the family, preferably to someone from a completely different genetic background. Even then, the effects won't disappear overnight. It will take multiple generations. And the individuals already affected, they can't be helped. The damage is permanent. The weight of this knowledge settled over Thomas like a physical burden. There's something else you need to know, Dr. Harrison continued, his voice dropping. What your family has been doing, particularly some of the closer relationships, it's not just biologically harmful. It's illegal in Kentucky. Has been since the 1800s. If certain authorities learn the full extent, there could be serious legal consequences. Children could be removed. Adults could face charges. Thomas's head snapped up. I'm not trying to get my family in trouble. I'm trying to save them. I know that, the doctor said quickly. And I'm not here to judge. I'm a physician, not a policeman. But you need to understand what you're dealing with. This isn't just a family matter anymore. They sat in silence. Thomas thought about his family, about the desperate isolation that had created this prison. What do I do? Thomas asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. You do the hardest thing a person can do, Dr. Harrison replied. You tell them the truth. You explain that continuing these patterns will destroy what's left of your family. You help them understand that change, as terrifying as it might be, is the only path to survival. And you prepare yourself for the possibility that they won't listen. That fear and tradition and isolation will win out. Thomas stood slowly, feeling decades older than his 24 years. Thank you, Doctor. For being honest. As Thomas reached the door, Dr. Harrison called out, Thomas, the fact that you came here, that takes courage. Real courage, the kind most people don't have. Whatever happens next, remember that. The walk back up the mountain was even longer than the descent. Thomas carried with him not just knowledge, but responsibility. He knew what needed to change and how devastating those changes would be. He knew he was asking people to abandon traditions stretching back generations, to admit their ancestors had been wrong, to acknowledge their way of life was unsustainable. When he reached the homestead, the family was gathered in the main cabin, waiting. They knew where he'd gone. They knew what he'd asked. Now they would hear the answer, whether they wanted to or not. Drop a comment right now with this sentence, the truth doesn't care if we're ready to hear it. If you can't look away from this story, if it's affecting you as much as it's supposed to, let me know you're still here. The meeting that night would be remembered by the survivors as the moment everything changed, or everything ended, depending on who was telling the story. All 17 members of the Harlow family crowded into the main cabin, from old Abraham down to the youngest child, 4-year-old Samuel, whose twisted spine made sitting upright nearly impossible. Thomas stood before them, Dr. Harrison's words still ringing in his ears, and prepared to destroy the foundation of everything his family believed. I talked to Dr. Harrison, he began, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. And he told me what we all already know, but refused to say out loud. What we've been doing generation after generation is killing us. We know it ain't ideal, Margaret interrupted, defensive. But it's kept the family together, kept the land together. The land. Daniel's voice cut through, sharp with anger. What good is the land if there's no one left to work it? What good is keeping the family together if the family is destroying itself? Thomas held up a hand. Let me finish, please. He took a breath and continued, repeating what the doctor had told him, translating medical terms into language his family could understand. He used the family itself as evidence. Great-great-grandfather Ezekiel and great-great-grandmother Ruth were first cousins. Thomas laid out the timeline. Their children had some health problems, but nothing severe. Then those children married each other and their cousins. Grandfather Silas married his niece Emma. That's when things got worse. Births that didn't survive. Children who couldn't walk right, couldn't think right. Then Papa and Mama, first cousins once removed, had us, and we're worse off than the generation before. He looked directly at Sarah, his voice softening. And now our generation is having children, and they're the worst affected of all. Mary can't walk, can't talk, can barely see. Samuel's spine is twisted. Little Ruth died before her first birthday. Anna has seizures every day. This isn't God testing us. This isn't bad luck. This is what happens when the same blood mixes too many times. So what? Abraham's voice was defiant, but underneath Thomas heard fear. What are you saying we should do? Abandon our ways? Bring in outsiders? Scatter the family to the winds? Yes, Thomas said simply. That's exactly what I'm saying. The explosion of voices was immediate. Margaret screaming about betrayal. Abraham threatening disownment. And Judith sobbing that they'd done their best. But gradually, other voices emerged. Sarah spoke up, her words halting but determined. I love Mary more than my own life, but if I'd known, if someone had told me before she was born what could happen, I wouldn't have. We shouldn't have. She couldn't finish, but everyone understood. Young Rebecca, the 13-year-old promised to Joseph, found her voice. I don't want to marry cousin Joseph. I don't want to have babies that hurt. I want to leave. I want to see what's beyond the hollow. Joseph himself, his webbed fingers clasped together, spoke the words that would haunt them all. If we know it hurts the babies and we keep doing it anyway, doesn't that make us bad people? The soldiers who hurt people on purpose in the war, they were bad. If we hurt our babies on purpose, aren't we bad too? The logic was undeniable, spoken with the brutal honesty that only someone with Joseph's limitations could deliver. The room fell silent. It was Daniel who broke the quiet, his voice tired but resolute. I can't have children. The doctors in the army hospital told me my body is too damaged, too deformed. They said it was genetic, that I inherited it from both parents because they were related. They said I was lucky to survive at all. He paused, looking around. I'm 22 years old and I'm lucky to be alive. That's what we've come to. Being alive is lucky, not expected. The meeting devolved into smaller conversations, family members breaking off into groups, arguing, crying, pleading. Some clung to tradition with desperate intensity. Others began to crack, to question, to wonder if maybe Thomas was right. It was well past midnight when the gathering finally dispersed. Nothing resolved, but everything changed. The silence that had protected the family's secrets for over a century had been broken. The truth, spoken aloud and undeniable, hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire. Over the following weeks, the homestead fractured. Thomas and Daniel made plans to leave. Rebecca ran away in early May. Joseph refused to participate. But others stayed. Margaret and Abraham refused to leave the land. Some felt it was too late for them to change. Tragically, some of the younger women, already expecting, had no choice but to stay. The family that had survived as an isolated unit for 166 years was tearing itself apart, not from outside pressure, but from the simple, devastating weight of truth finally spoken aloud. On June 15, 1946, Thomas Harlow walked down the mountain path for the last time, carrying a single bag. Behind him, Sarah stood in the doorway, holding Mary. The choice he'd given her was impossible: come with him and leave Mary behind, or stay. She had chosen to stay. As Thomas disappeared into the forest, Sarah turned back into the cabin where generations of Harlows had lived and loved and destroyed themselves slowly. The hollow swallowed her back into its embrace, and the cycle, damaged but not yet broken, continued. 3 years passed before anyone outside learned the full extent of what happened after Thomas left. What emerged was a story of tragedy compounded by isolation. By 1949, the Harlow family had dwindled to 9 members. The arithmetic of ruin had finally caught up. Old Abraham died in the winter of 1947. Margaret followed within 6 months. But it wasn't age decimating the family. It was the children. Between 1946 and 1949, 4 more babies were born in the Hollow. None survived past 18 months. The youngest, born to Sarah and conceived before Thomas left, lived only 3 days. The infant's skull hadn't properly formed, a catastrophic neural tube defect Dr. Harrison would later attribute to extreme genetic homozygosity. Sarah never recovered. Joseph refused to marry Rebecca. "No making hurt," he repeated. Eventually, the family gave up trying to force him. Daniel, from his new life in Pikeville, tried to maintain contact. But each letter went unanswered. The rift wasn't just about leaving. It was about disloyalty, about choosing truth over tradition. Thomas had moved to Lexington, married a woman named Helen from a healthy, unrelated family. When their first child was born in 1948, a healthy baby girl with no deformities, Thomas wept. He named her Hope. But guilt haunted him. Every night he thought about Mary, about Sarah, about the family who had refused to leave. It wasn't until August 1949 that the outside world finally intervened. A new social worker heard rumors. A welfare check was triggered. What authorities found shocked even seasoned professionals. Of the 9 remaining Harlows, 6 showed obvious signs of severe genetic disorders. The living conditions were appalling. The children were malnourished and neglected, not from cruelty, but because their caregivers were themselves too compromised. Mary, now 5, had never grown beyond the size of an 18-month-old. She couldn't walk, speak, or feed herself. Social workers immediately moved for emergency removal. The legal proceedings exposed everything. Court documents detailed generations of consanguineous relationships. Genetic testing confirmed Dr. Harrison's predictions. The level of homozygosity was among the highest ever documented. 6 children, including Mary, were removed. Sarah was institutionalized. The remaining adults were also removed. The homestead was condemned. The land was sold to pay for care. By December 1949, the Harlow Hollow stood empty. Nature began reclaiming what humans had held too tightly for too long. Thomas drove back when he learned what happened. He visited Mary in the state facility. His daughter didn't recognize him. He stood at her bedside, this 5-year-old child who would never have a normal life, and felt the full weight of generations of mistakes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "We didn't know." "No, that was a lie. We knew. We just didn't want to admit it." Joseph's words echoed in his mind. If we know it hurts the babies and we keep doing it anyway, doesn't that make us bad people? Yes, Thomas thought. Yes, it does. The Harlow case became a cautionary tale in medical literature, cited in early genetics papers. Dr. Harrison published a sanitized version. It became required reading, a stark reminder that isolation and tradition could be as deadly as any disease. The surviving Harlow children lived out their lives in institutions. Most didn't make it past their teens. Mary died at 11. She was buried in Pikeville Cemetery, far from the Hollow that had been both her birthplace and her curse. Thomas lived into his 70s. His marriage produced 3 more healthy children and 7 grandchildren. None showed any signs of the genetic catastrophes. The fresh genetic material had done its work. But he never stopped having nightmares about the Hollow. He never stopped wondering if he could have done more. The truth, as Dr. Harrison had told him, was that some things couldn't be undone. Some choices, once made and repeated across generations, created consequences that echoed through time and blood and DNA. The Harlows hadn't been cursed by spirits. They had been destroyed by arithmetic, by the cold mathematics of genetics, by the simple biological reality that diversity is survival and isolation is death. The Hollow remains empty to this day. Local hikers occasionally stumble across the ruins. They don't know the full story. They don't know about the bloodlines that twisted back on themselves until they strangled. But those who do know understand the lesson that some traditions deserve to die. That some silences should be broken. That some truths, no matter how painful, must be spoken before it's too late. The cursed warriors of the Appalachians weren't spirits returning from the grave. They were young men returning from war with eyes open to a world beyond their isolated hollow. Men who had seen enough death on battlefields to recognize death happening slowly at home. They were warriors who fought against the weight of 169 years of generational momentum, against the desperate grip of tradition, against the silence that had protected and destroyed their family in equal measure. Some, like Thomas and Daniel, survived the battle and built new lives. Others, like Joseph and Sarah, were casualties of a war raging long before they were born, a war fought in chromosomes and alleles, in twisted bones and malformed brains. The hollow keeps its silence now, the way it always has. But the silence is different. It's no longer protecting secrets. It's mourning the lives that were lived and lost there. And in that silence, if you listen carefully, you might hear an echo of Joseph's simple question, the one that cut through all the rationalization and tradition. If we know it hurts the babies and we keep doing it anyway, doesn't that make us bad people? The answer, written in the ruins and in the graves of children who never had a chance, is the most painful truth of all. Yes. If you've watched until the end, you understand why this story matters. We're documenting histories that society tried to bury. The next case will challenge everything you think you know about family secrets. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end, so I can get to know who truly appreciates these stories here on the channel." If this investigation moved you, hit that like button and please share this with someone who needs to understand that the darkest truths are often hidden in plain sight, protected by silence and tradition until someone has the courage to speak.